Took me quite a while to recognize that actually in my 20s, I was afraid of and ashamed of my masculinity. And so I just thought, well, maybe if I become more feminine and just de-emphasize my masculinity, then everything's gonna be fine. It wasn't. I was controlling, I was manipulative, I was insecure, a lot of fear, a lot of tension in my system because I wasn't in balance. There was some big part of me that was missing that I'd found too hard to love in myself. And so it wasn't until I started finding healthier male role models that I thought to myself, oh, there's something really beautiful here. This is really important. Masculinity is an important part of who I am. And I need to find a balance so that I can really show up in my authentic power in the world. So that continues to be my journey, but it's a journey that has led me to do this work with others, to work with men around cultivating a wholehearted approach of masculinity rather than a fragmented approach or a man box approach. And I think it's interesting because from a racialized perspective, you know, I haven't had some of what you shared, some of the intensity that you've experienced around a Black experience of masculinity. I think the stereotype threat, for example, I think for white men might be more of a status threat. And it's because the basic survival need, the basic safety need is generally met. But then beyond that, there's the competition for who's going to outperform the people around you, who's going to push and win and shove and kick and be the best, you know, the king of the mountain approach. And that's what capitalism has oriented us to engage in, but it's also what patriarchy has oriented us to engage in. And it's what white supremacy is premised on, which is the idea of having to be above the other person or the other group. And so if I'm going to keep feeling significant, feeling like I'm valuable, that I even deserve to exist on this earth as a white man, then I have to go and perform and achieve and show that I'm better than someone else, or ideally better than most people. And I think that carries a really intense weight and pressure that then fuels the very same cycle of dehumanization and inequality, and causes a lot of harm that we then can't speak about and can't fully feel or process because we have had our emotional capacity undermined by that very same culture. I choose to be pretty careful in how I talk about white male pain because, typically because there are a lot of caveats and a lot of context that makes that helpful or unhelpful. Because yes, on the one hand, we have enormous opportunity and access and privilege and safety and advantage and historic wealth and all these things. And also we are perpetuating a lot of the harm. We're authoring a lot of the harm that people are experiencing, including amongst ourselves, but also with other groups. And so all of that being said, it begs the question, you know, there's a saying, hurt people hurt people. And so the question that I have been asking for a long time is, what is the pain in us that's finding expression out through violence against other people? Because that violence doesn't just come from nowhere. You know, little boys aren't born violent. Little white boys aren't any more violent or aggressive than anybody else. So what is it in our culture, in our society, just in the air we breathe together that is leading to these outcomes? And I think it's a combination of the ignorance by design. And we don't see the ways the systems are moving through us, the ways that racism and sexism and homophobia are moving through us, particularly as white men, because we don't have to. There's no urgency to that for us to get through our world and our daily life and our career without a block, whereas it's not true for other groups often. And so it's that ignorance by design, designed to be invisible on the one hand, but then it's also the pain of almost being hazed into manhood. You know, it's almost like a fraternity culture of, you know, don't rat out the brotherhood. Don't like say something bad about this other guy, you know, bros before hoes, like really intense stuff that people learn in middle school, you know, that you learn in the locker room or you learn in the sports team or you learn wherever. And that kind of, or at home, yeah, that kind of mentality tends to have us get really quiet when it comes to these issues, and to find that it's scary and dangerous to lean into them. And it's not for us. This work isn't for us. And so then we shy away from the very doorway that would lead us into our own liberation, because we see it as a threat to our belonging with our peer group inside of, white supremacy culture. We hear a lot about toxic masculinity, for example, and the first thing that a lot of guys I've often heard hear in that is they hear, "You think I'm toxic? There's something inherently wrong with me," right? And the same thing with racism. "You think I'm racist? You're calling me a racist," right? And I think what gives me, I'm getting to the hope. What gives me such profound hope is recognizing the difference between the bad actor notion of racism or sexism, where, there are individual racists and individual sexists who are these monsters, and you're calling me one of them, to instead recognizing the structural nature of these systems of oppression, the structural nature of racism and sexism, and the way that they move through each of us, regardless of our intentions, that they are impacting and influencing us. And so as I've been able to separate out from the individualistic perspective to the structural perspective, I've been able to say, oh, I have a choice. There is nothing inherently racist about me, or inherently sexist, or inherently bad or toxic. I am choosing how I'm going to either uphold or resist the systems that I was enculturated into. And there are many others choosing to resist. So I can join in that resistance. And that resistance can be a humanizing and liberatory force in my life, and support work in the world that is also serving that cause. And as I've begun to build community and find others who are doing that work, then I'm not so alone anymore. And the price that I initially was afraid to pay, the price of loss of belonging, loss of status, etc., actually feels like I've gained so much more now. Gaining connection, gaining emotional humanity and expressiveness and agility. And I think when we see that there's another way that's possible, there are other cultures of masculinity, there are other ways to be in a white male body in this world that aren't just about maintaining the status quo or feeling terrible about it, but we can actually move into something together across lines of difference, then that becomes a much more powerful narrative for us each to live into and be co-authors of.